the effective working of an empire requires the cooperation of local populations. This is a lesson that the British Empire will learn in the American Revolution. And the rights and the power of the British Empire through the 19th century. By 1890, the British Empire encompasses 25% of all land in the world. The sun does not set on the British Empire. Everywhere in the world, someplace the sun is shining on the British Empire. They organized this empire in the 19th century, and they operated fairly successful because of the lessons they learned in the American Revolution. They require the local population, at least a sizable percentage of the local population, doesn't have to be a majority, but at least a minority of the local population needs to benefit from the empire being there. They need to help you govern your empire. British learned this lesson the same way most people learn lessons, the hard way, trial and error. Trial and error they're going to have is going to be the American Revolution. Time and again, British officials will back down in the face of colonial resistance, only to return with new measures to centralize control of their empire, which will further stiffen colonial resolve. The first example they try is almost immediately after the end of the war. It's the Sugar Act of 1764. This reduced the tax on imported molasses from French West Indies Caribbean colonies. So you can now trade with French Caribbean colonies if you're in the English colonies. You just have to pay a tax on it, but it's going to reduce that tax. But it's also going to strengthen the patrolling for smuggling. They're going to send 8 warships and 12 armored sloops to patrol the waters on the eastern seaboard to look for smugglers, because the British Empire discovered that they were losing 700,000 pounds a year to smuggling. Because if you're smuggling sugar, you're not paying the taxes, you're not paying the tariffs, the British government is not getting their due. So we're going to start strengthening the British Navy. We're going to also pass a law under the Sugar Act that if you are captured smuggling, if you are one of these people smuggling sugar out of the Caribbean and you're not following the law, and you're captured by the British Navy, you will not be tried in the colonies, you'll be tried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is up in Canada where there's a big Navy base. You'll be tried in Admiralty Court. Admiralty Court is a court made up not of your peers, but of naval officers. So imagine this, your job in the Navy is to look for smugglers. You found a smuggler, and then who gets to try that guy whether he's guilty or not of smuggling? The people who caught him. That's like the police being the jury for catching people when they're crooks. This isn't going to upset a lot of people. It will upset merchants and those people in the shipping business, but your average Joe in the colonies, your average farmer in the colonies, the Sugar Act is not really a bad thing. It doesn't really show up on your radar. It doesn't impact your day-to-day life. This is also a law that's passed in 1764 that is in the traditional way in which Britain has been controlling its colonies since the 1650s. This law focuses on trade. It focuses on what happens when you try to get the raw materials out of the colonies to the mother country. It's something that most colonists are fine with. However, it does start rumblings amongst those elite that are in the shipping business, the sugar business, and of course those folks like John Hancock who are making a pretty good living smuggling. The next year, November 1st, 1765, you get the big one. This is the Stamp Act. This is a complete departure from all previous policies towards the colonies, which is why it's one of your key terms. For the first time, Parliament is attempting to raise money on a direct tax on the colonies instead of regulating trade. Here's what the Stamp Act calls for. All printed materials in the colony require a stamp purchased from the authorities. That'll include newspapers, books, court documents, commercial papers, land deeds, almanacs, playing cards, college degrees. You have to pay the tax in order to get these items. We have the stamp still. Anybody ever get anything notarized? You have to go to a notary public. You have to pay the tax on it. That's a stamp. You're getting the stamp on it. You know, sometimes it's a physical stamp. Sometimes it's just a piece of paper or something like that. But this is where it comes from. These stamps are going to be required for basically any paper good that you want to buy. You want to buy 50 acres of land from your neighbor, you got to pay for one of these stamps, because that has to show up on the land deed. You want to graduate from Harvard, get a college degree, 2 pounds sterling silver must be paid in order to get the stamp on your college degree. Playing cards, same thing. You want to buy a newspaper, there's going to be an added tax put on this newspaper. All this money raised from the Stamp Act is going to go to finance the cost of stationing British troops in America for defense of the colonies. So once again, Parliament in London is passing this law to help defray the costs of keeping a larger group of soldiers in British North America. In their heads, in Parliament in London, they're going, this makes sense. You're going to help pay for this because it's going to something that you do. Think about this. We have here in Texas the sporting goods tax, where when it was initially passed, all this tax is put on all sporting goods. So you go to Academy and you buy a kayak, you go buy a baseball bat or something like that, you would have to pay a little extra money. The idea behind that tax was, when they passed it about 10, 15 years ago, was the tax money raised on the sporting goods tax would then go to Texas Parks and Wildlife to help build the parks up, to help provide for cleaner rivers, to help provide for fishing programs. So you see how it's kind of, you're going to the sporting goods store to buy fishing poles and fishing bait, and then that money, extra money you're paying, is going to help something that you're going to use anyway because you went and bought the fishing poles to go use it. It's still a tax. And the gut reaction for most people is that we don't like taxes. But if it goes towards something that we think are helping people, or it's going to help me, then it's not something makes the medicine go down a little better, a little sweeter, a little sugar with that medicine. Parliament is saying this isn't a bad idea. Likewise, Parliament is looking at all the other taxes that they've levied. The colonists pay no taxes directly levied against them until 1765. And then the Stamp Act comes along, and even then they're still not paying anywhere near 5% as much taxes as everybody else is being paid. If you lived in Manchester, England, if you lived in Birmingham, England, if you lived in London, England, you were being taxed more than anybody else in the entire world. And then the colonists get taxed. So in the minds of people in London, this isn't a big deal. It's just a little extra money you got to pay us. And oh, by the way, we're going to take that little extra money and we're pumping it right back towards you, because we're paying the soldiers that protect you from the French, from the Spanish, from the Indians. So you can, I explain it this way because I want you to imagine being a parliamentarian, being someone living in England, and all of a sudden just seeing the incredible amount of resistance that occurred when this came out. The colonists lost their minds over this. This alarmed and offended virtually every colonist, rich and poor. Whereas the Sugar Act offends merchants and guys who sell sugar, this impacts everybody. It's resented by members of the public sphere who read newspapers and read books. It's offended by newspaper editors. All of a sudden you have to increase the price of your newspaper. So imagine you now have to increase the price of your newspaper. So now you're going to write an editorial about the Stamp Act. Are you in favor of it? No, it's hurting your business. Directly hurting your business. People are less likely to buy your newspaper now because it costs more. So it's no surprise that every single colonial newspaper in the British colonies in North America came out against the Stamp Act, because they felt it was just literally reaching into their pockets and taking money out of their pockets. It also touched the nerve with the colonial elite, who controlled the assemblies, who controlled the colonial legislatures. Parliament had directly challenged their authority. From 1607 until 1765, how you operated your day-to-day life, your day-to-day community, your day-to-day colony was up to the colonial legislatures. And now Parliament just showed up in 1765 and said, we're going to establish this tax, you're going to pay it, and we're not going to let you know about it. The first time you heard about the Stamp Act was when the guy got off the boat from England going, hi, I'm the stamp tax collector, I'm here to collect the stamp taxes. The Stamp Act crisis becomes the first real rift between the colonists and the mother country. Nearly every colonial leader voiced their disapproval, and they invoked their rights as free-born Englishmen, insisting that only their elected officials, the colonial assemblies that they vote for, can levy taxes against them. They argued the John Locke theory of the social contract in which liberty cannot be secure when property was taken away without consent. So let's turn away real quick here from the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, and let's journey all the way back to the 1690s and talk about John Locke. On his second treatise of government, John Locke described what he called the social compact. This is how societies organize themselves. Government legitimacy, whether we're speaking of a monarchy or a tribal government or a newly elected government, all governments' legitimacies, what makes them the legitimate government of your society, comes from the people's delegation to the government of their absolute right of violence. Very simply put, a society exists because we decide as a group of people, as a society, to turn over one of our rights, one of our absolute rights, to the government. And the basic right that we hand over, every society hands over this right to the government. The basic right they hand over to the government is the right of violence. In a chaotic society, in an anarchic society, how do you defend yourself? You defend yourself with violence. If someone attacks you, if someone takes your property, you defend yourself. Once you start organizing society, we can't have everybody in our society killing each other over every little tiff, every little argument. So we as a society collectively give over our right of violence to the state. Who has the right to kill someone in this country? No one does. Only the state. Only the state has the right to kill. They do it in Huntsville, Texas all the time. That is the right given to the state. Now, let's not talk about morals or anything like that, whether we should be doing this or whether we shouldn't be doing it. That doesn't matter. According to the social compact, we decided as a society to get together and decided in order to have a peaceful society, a safer society, we needed to give up a couple of our rights. The most basic being the right to defend ourselves or to kill other people, and hand that over to the state. So now the state is the only legal entity in this country that has the right to kill people. Now, if you join the army, you go overseas and you fight in a war, you have the right to kill people over there too, but that is not your individual right. That is because you are an arm of the state, a representation of the state, which is why it's legal for you to kill people in a warfare. When you get done with the war and you come back over here, it's not legal for you to kill your neighbor. It may sound silly, but basically every single society in this world is built upon that idea. That only some people have the right to kill people, and most societies decide that is the government's right. In order to achieve security, through granting the state a monopoly on violence, this makes the government the impartial judge to the use of collective will of the people to enforce laws. So for John Locke, the rights of the people are turned over to the government. That's the social compact. It is not a one-way street, however, according to John Locke. John Locke argues that the people are the duly represented foundation of the government. The people give their permission for the government to have certain rights, to take away your rights to have them. In this country, I'm not allowed to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. The Supreme Court has come down and said that that is not protected under the freedom of speech, under the First Amendment, because if I yell fire in a crowded movie theater, everybody will panic and maybe a couple people will get trampled to death trying to get out of the theater. So the government has come in and said that your right to freedom of speech has a limitation because it may impact the welfare and safety of other people. And we debate this stuff all the time. But Locke says this idea of the social compact. He says if the people decide that the government that they have given their rights to is now a tyrannical government, is now superseding the authority that the people have decided to give them, then it is the right or duty of the people to take the rights back and to form a new government. He writes this in the 1690s. People read it. By the time we get to the 1760s, every person who's a colonial elite, every member of the colonial legislature, if they've had an education, they've read Locke. Benjamin Franklin's read Locke, George Washington's read Locke, John Adams has read Locke, Thomas Jefferson's read Locke, all Patrick Henry, they all read Locke. And many of them conceive their worldview within that idea of rights. Locke is the first one to talk about universal rights. Most colonial people, however, in 1765, the first thing they're going to is not their rights guaranteed by them being human beings, it's their rights guaranteed them as Englishmen under the English common law. Locke is also existing in England in the 1690s. He's writing within the tradition of the English common law. And so he is arguing that this is an extension for him. What is guaranteed under the English common law, you have certain rights that even the king cannot ignore. He says those rights can be expanded out universally. Radical idea. In 1765, the colonists get together in the Stamp Act Congress. So here we have the Albany Congress, but only larger. 27 delegates from 9 colonies meet in New York City. There, they get together, and the first thing they do is they all get together and reaffirm their loyalty to the king. He is the sovereign leader of them. They are loyal British subjects. However, they demand the right of consent to passing laws that apply directly to them, because, quote, consent is essential to the freedom of a people. Pretty soon, merchants in many urban areas are boycotting British goods. Both the Stamp Act Congress and the boycotting of the goods mark the first major cooperative action among the British colonies. For the first time ever, we have New York and Massachusetts and Virginia and South Carolina getting together, and instead of just arguing, they're still arguing with each other. They actually are doing something together as a united group. Which is quite unexpected. Parliament, by imposing a uniform law on all the colonies, instead of just imposing it on one colony and then imposing it on this colony, the end result was they united all the colonies. The Stamp Act Congress also creates committees of correspondence. These are going to be educated men in the cities and areas of the different colonies who will write to each other. So all of a sudden you're going to have a group of guys in Boston who are writing to a group of guys in New York City. What's going on in New York City? How are you boycotting British goods there? Here's what's happening in Boston. Along the way, these committees of correspondence will grow and grow and grow until every colony by 1770 has multiple groups who are talking to everybody. Initiated by the colonial elite, pretty soon the process began drawing in a broader range of Americans, folks from the working classes, folks from the middling classes, ethnic Germans, ethnic Scotch-Irish, ethnic Irish, are all getting together in these committees of correspondence, usually at the local tavern, having a pint, having a drink, and talking about what they're going to do with the British-made goods, how are they going to fight against the Stamp Act. John Adams, who in 1766 was a lawyer from Braintree, Massachusetts, wrote that the Stamp Act inspired the people, even to the lowest ranks, to become more attentive to their liberties, more inquisitive about them, and more determined to defend them than they ever were known before. Political debate pervaded the colonies. You start seeing groups of colonists forming themselves into groups known as the Sons of Liberty. Secret organizations that will agitate the people, lead processions through the streets protesting the Stamp Act. They'll also plaster the walls and other things with mottos like liberty, prosperity, and no stamps. Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. So they initiated it November 1st of 1765. Within less than a year, they revoked it. The bad idea. Way too much pushback from the colonists, and the British government said, you know what, not worth the hassle, you would. When they repealed the Stamp Act, however, they passed, along with that, something called the Declaration Act. That declared that the colonists' claims that only their elected representatives could pass taxes was not valid. The Parliament stated emphatically that the power to pass laws for the colonies and the peoples of America, in all cases whatever, belongs to Parliament in London. So then, Parliament passes the Townshend Duties in 1767. That goes back to what they've been focusing on all the times before. This is about trade and regulation of economic activity, not a direct tax on the people. This appeared to appease a lot of colonists, because at the first there was not a lot of opposition to this. Because once again, they're focusing on trading sugar, trading molasses, trading rice, only trading with England. However, by 1768, several colonial leaders had resurrected the boycott on British goods. It began in Boston, and it soon spread down to the Chesapeake and the Middle Colonies. Colonial women began replacing English cloth by wearing homespun cloth that they could make themselves. And this is a good kind of cultural shift we're seeing here. All of a sudden, women who before would establish their prominence and their desirability and their economic class by importing silk and English-made cloth, now all of a sudden these same wealthy women are wearing homespun. And if you go out in English finery, if you go out in English cloth, and what are you advertising? You're not just advertising your cultural idea of beauty, you're also advertising your political opinion. If you don't wear homespun cloth, then you are in support of the Townshend Duties. And certain people will not want to hang out with you anymore. Certain people will make fun of you. Certain people will probably throw things at you. And if you are one of these women in a colonial society where you are the elite and you live in Boston, there's like 10,000 people living in Boston. So guess what? The colonial elite all know each other. They all go to the same parties. They all hang out at each other's houses. And when your friends start doing something differently, the pressure is there for you to do it as well, lest you be left behind or ridiculed or whatever. Many people start arguing for non-importation. Let's stop buying the goods from England and start relying on self-sufficiency. Things we can make at home, like homespun dresses. Let's make our own cloth. Let's make our own shoes. Other colonists, like George Washington, liked this idea too, because a lot of them were in debt to British merchants. Washington wrote that you could, by adopting homespun, a planter could, quote, maintain the liberty which we have derived from our ancestors, while also reducing our considerable debts. So, 2 for 1 there. You can be a good colonist, uphold your rights as a freeborn Englishman, and hey, I don't have to keep going into debt buying all this French-made, English-made cloth and wine. Urban artisans, those folks in the cities that are glassmakers or coopers or blacksmiths or shoemakers, they're going to benefit from this as well, because if you're no longer getting those things made in England and shipped overseas, you now rely upon urban artisans. So I have more money coming in, I can make more goods, I can make a better living. Street protests erupted in many cities, and once again the Sons of Liberty are out there attempting to enforce the boycott. There you go. Pro Patricia, the first man that either distributes or makes use of stamps, paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. Vox Populi, voice of the people. Very subtle. Very subtle. Oh, you want to buy the stamps? You want to break the boycott? Well, take care. Fires happen all the time. Houses burn down all the time. People have accidents all the time. It's a big, scary world out there. We'd sure hate for you to have an accident. Take care.
Did the Sons of Liberty start because of the Stamp Act?
Yes. It sounds like a vigilante group. That's because they are. they go out and they enforce the boycott. You don't want to boycott homespun cloth? You want to buy English pottery? Well, convince you not to do that. Do a variety of different ways. Threats, subtle notes, your barn burned down. In the midst of all of this, we have what is termed the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. There are 2,000 soldiers living in Boston at that time, 2,000 British soldiers stationed there. The start of the massacre is, this whole event is very much wrapped up in propaganda. We call it a massacre because that's what the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere called it. And that's the depiction we have that was painted by Paul Revere. Here we see a group of well-dressed, middle-class, colonial elite, all white men, being attacked by a united, organized British group of soldiers who are being ordered by their officer to fire into a crowd that is unarmed and peacefully assembled. That is a terrible historical interpretation of the event. That's an interpretation that if you're Paul Revere of the Sons of Liberty that you would like to spread out. That's the Boston Massacre. Here's what we know what happened. A solitary guard is guarding the customs house in the early morning of March 5th, 1770. A group of dock workers, children, show up and start insulting him. They start calling him a lobster back. That was a slur they had for the redcoats. They start throwing things at him. They start throwing snowballs at him. They start throwing chunks of ice at him. A few people throw rocks at him. He calls for reinforcements. His captain and a group of soldiers come out, and they stand in front of him as well. They don't point their guns. They have their guns with them, but they don't point. The crowd gets larger. They get more vicious. They start throwing other things. They start throwing raw cabbage, food, stones. All of a sudden, you have them agitating. You won't shoot, you won't shoot, you won't shoot. Fire, fire, fire. At which point, someone is pushed. Something happens. A shot goes off. At which point, they shoot the rest of them. Soldiers and the people, especially the working people of Boston, had a pretty tense relationship. 2,000 soldiers stationed in Boston. They're stationed there, they're paid by the crown, but they're not working all the time. Soldiers have days off just like everybody else does, and they don't get paid a lot. So they've taken to going down to the docks and going into the working class neighborhoods and offering their services. Hey, on my day off, you mind if I come down to the docks and I start loading boxes, or I take this off and I'll do this, I'll do that. And you don't have to pay me much, just a little bit, just a little extra money, a little side gig, a little side hustle, you know. Well, what if you're one of the working people on the docks who loads and takes off cargo? What if all of a sudden there's a large group of people in your city who are offering their services in your job, and they're offering less than what you are paying? What's your boss going to do? Yeah, your boss is going to start hiring these other guys and not hiring you. They took my job. Not the first time that claim is made in American history. And so these guys, as they're thinking here, like, you know, the well-respected. No, the people who are starting the Boston Massacre are going to be working class guys. They're going to be ethnically diverse. You're going to have Native Americans. You're going to have black guys there. You're going to have all this. You have children who are out. It's 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. To quote my father, if anybody's up and out at 4 o'clock in the morning, what are they up to? Not any good. You know, if you're out past midnight, you're up to something, you know. So it's not quite this kind of one-sided interpretation, but it is a pretty devastating event. 5 Bostonians are killed. 8 British soldiers and their commanding officer are arrested and put on trial. John Adams is hired to defend them. And his defense is pretty straightforward. He says these are soldiers. They are at their post. They are told to guard this post. They are confronted with a mob that is not only rowdy, is throwing things at them, is attacking them, is telling them to fire, to shoot. They felt like they were in danger, so they fired. And so every single one of them is found not guilty. But it becomes a propaganda coup for the Sons of Liberty. This painting, which is made by Paul Revere, is reprinted, and the story of the Boston Massacre is spread throughout the colonies. The Sons of Liberty gain more membership, and the idea that a tyrannical British government with its thugs, its soldiers out on the streets, killing innocent men, is going to be a boom. This event and the protests surrounding the Boston Massacre, along with the protests for the Townsend Act, lead to the repeal of the Townsend Act. However, they do leave one tax on a good, and that is the Tea Act of 1773. See, the problem with the Tea Act, the reason they left tea off was that the East India Company, which was a private company that had a monopoly on the tea trade in Asia, they were losing a lot of money. And now you're running an empire, and one of the largest corporations within your empire is now threatening to go bankrupt. You know that if they go bankrupt, that's going to have a cascading effect along the economy, and it's going to hurt the economic power of your empire. It's going to cause a recession, people are going to lose jobs and lose money. What do governments do when companies that are too big to fail are on the verge of failing? They bail them out. So like the banking, the recession crisis, the housing crisis of 2008, all those banks, Enron, some of them failed. Many of our largest banking institutions, the federal government passed a bill and gave them millions and millions of dollars because they were deemed too big to fail. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. You know, it's problematic. You know, my grandfather ran a small appliance shop most of his life. He managed to be pretty successful in it, but you know, if he had been failing, had some bad years, was the federal government going to give him millions of dollars? No, but he's just one guy. Them that got, them that has, gets. If your company is powerful enough to where if you fail, it would be a spiraling effect on the entire economy, which we saw in 2008 with the housing crisis, with the automobile bailouts, with the banking bailouts. We are just now recovering from the recession, like in the past 3 years. All of a sudden, for the first time in the past 10, 15 years, wages are increasing. You know, that's how bad the recession was in 2008. You know, you buy a house like that in 2008, they would give you a credit card like that in 2008 because they needed liquid income, they needed liquid capital. The East India Company is deemed too big to fail by the British government because if they let that company fail, they're going to lose the monopoly on the tea trade, and that's going to impact their economic power. And under mercantilism, how does the British Empire maintain its power? Through its wealth of trade networks. So, the Tea Act of 1773 is a bailout. Instead of just directly giving money to the East India Company, they now allow tax rebates on tea, and they basically say that the East India Company will now be the sole provider for tea for the British North America. So if you are a tea drinker in British North America, and by the 1770s, a lot of colonists are big tea drinkers, you now have one person to buy tea from, that is the East India Company. So once again, laws of supply and demand. There's just one person supplying it. There's still a high demand. What can the price be? Whatever you want it to be. What are you going to do? Not buy tea? That's what we did. So this leads to boycotting tea and the Boston Tea Party. December 16th, 1773. Sons of Liberty, some dressed as Mohawk Indians, went into Boston Harbor, where they went onto ships owned by the East India Company, and they dumped 300 chests of tea into the harbor. That was a loss incurred by the East India Company of 10,000 pounds, money pounds, which in today's money is roughly $4 million. So, a group of vigilantes went onto private property, destroyed private property. What is the government's response to this? Well, the Intolerable Acts is the response. Now, the Intolerable Acts is not what Parliament called this legislation in 1774. That's what we as Americans call it because of propaganda and interpretation. But here's what the Intolerable Acts are. This is a direct response to the Boston Tea Party, and these are directed only at Massachusetts. The Port of Boston will be closed until you pay off the 10,000 pounds worth of tea that you destroyed. All town meetings and public assemblies will be curtailed. The royal governor will have power to shut down the colonial assemblies, to shut down the colonial legislature. The royal governor will now have more power to dictate laws in the colony of Massachusetts. Military commanders now have freedom to lodge soldiers in private homes because we're going to increase the number of soldiers in Boston. All this happens at the same time as this piece of Parliament legislation known as the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act has nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party or the Intolerable Acts. It just has the misfortune of happening at the exact same time as the Intolerable Acts. And let me give you an idea of what the Quebec Act is. The Quebec Act allows French Canadian Catholics to settle in the Ohio River Valley. So, let's go back to this map real quick. Proclamation line of 1763 says nobody can settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Fast forward to 1774. The Quebec Act now allows French Canadians who are Catholic to settle in the Ohio River Valley. English settlers can't settle there. So, add this all together. One, you now have to pay back the East India Company $4 million worth of the tea you destroyed. Two, they just closed the Boston port. No ships are allowed to come into Boston, no ships are allowed to leave. How are you going to make money to do that? How are you going to feed your citizens? How are you going to feed the people in Boston? You now rely upon either smuggling. Guess what? The British Navy is parked right in that harbor. That harbor is tight too. Here we have that's Boston. Boston sits on a peninsula, which is almost an island, with a short isthmus right here, connected to the land. This is the main road into Boston. That's it. Everything else is by sea. And the British Navy is just going to sit right here. So now you have to rely upon New England to provide food and stuff like that. You're going to be under a lot of pressure to pay off this debt. Your trade is going to become, so if you're a merchant man, if you're a shipbuilder, if you're in the shipping industry, no more jobs. That's what they're going to have to do. They're going to have to rely upon other colonies. That's going to be one of the consequences of the Intolerable Acts, is that they're going to rely more and more upon New England at first. So just this is only directed at Massachusetts. So Connecticut and Rhode Island and Vermont and New Hampshire and that area of Maine up there, they can help out. And so what you're going to see after the Intolerable Acts is that New England is really going to start kind of coalescing together. And they're going to be in this boat together. Other colonies will help as well, but since New England is like right there, you're now really dependent upon that. You also have this kind of tyrannical government happening. So they basically said you can't meet in your assemblies, you can't meet in your legislature. The royal governor is going to have all the power. Who appoints the royal governor? The king does. So once again, the rights of your English-born rights are being trampled upon. Quartering of troops. I mean, most people don't like their family staying with them more than 3 days, you know. Fish and family both start stinking. Fish and house guests both start stinking after 3 days. That's a Benjamin Franklin quote. Now you have soldiers, people you don't know. This guy's living with you now. You have to feed him. Oh, you don't like that idea? Guess what? He's got a gun, and so do all of us. So clear some room out, welcome your new roommate. His name's Steve, and he likes his eggs poached. Steve's going to be living in your house. You don't like that? We have guns. We have jails. We have penal colonies we can send you to. Private property is one of the most sacred rights we as Americans have. The fact that I can have my house and do what I want in my house, my right. And it's something that Americans are fiercely guarded about.
How many people were involved in the Boston Tea Party?
Oh, like,
Doing?
anywhere between like 50 and 100.
And then everybody else paid for that.
So once again, there's people in Boston who are fully behind the Sons of Liberty, who feel this is a tyrannical government. There's people in Boston who are like, well, you know, once again, this is something that we hear all the time. Like, you know, people go out and they protest something, they damage property, and they get arrested. And what's that response? Well, if you don't want to get arrested, don't break the law. Real simple. Real simple society we created here. You don't want to go to jail? Don't break the law. And so there are people in Boston who are like, they're mad at the Sons of Liberty. They're mad at the people who did this because you're hurting my family. You're hurting my business now because your stupid protest against freaking tea. You know, so that argument, yeah.
How long did it take for the colony start working again? Was it slow or was it?
It's pretty slow. Pretty slow. It's going to be, so this is 1774. So what happens in 1776? We declare independence and we have the war. So this is how quickly this is happening. But this has taken, you know, since 1765 to get to this point. The Intolerable Acts are really going to be something that really kind of draws people together. The other thing too is I want to get back to this Quebec Act, is this helps really upset New Englanders too. What are the bulk of people in New England? They're all, what religion were they part of? Protestant, but particularly they were that. They wanted to purify the Church of England. Puritans. And the Puritans are really all the way back to the Plymouth Rock and all the way back to John Winthrop. So this is talking about 150 years previous. All these people are descendants from Puritans. And they may have watered down that theology a little bit. But once again, a core thing in the Puritan faith is that we are building a city upon the hill, a kingdom of God on earth, and we have to keep an eye out for those heathens. And who are those heathens? Native Americans and the French. French Catholics. There's still a large anti-Catholic bias in New England. They don't like Catholicism. And now all of a sudden, at the same time all this stuff is happening in Boston, you have the Quebec Act, which is the king telling a bunch of French Catholics, oh, you know that place all those English people can't live? You can totally live there. Come into the Ohio River Valley. The cause of liberty for many people become the cause of God. Boston is seen as victims of a tyrannical government bent on taking away Englishmen rights. And then with the Quebec Act, you now have this New Englanders mingling the fears of religious and political tyranny together. The king will allow Catholics to have more land and more power. That's going to impact us down the road. We're going to be hemmed in around Catholics, and we're not going to have as much power as we used to. This is Farmington, Connecticut, May 1774, the Sons of Liberty. As sons of freedom, we will resist any attempt to take away our liberties and properties and to enslave us forever. And then they accuse the British of being instigated by the devil. So you have political and religious stuff kind of being combined up in New England to create a very forceful group of people who are like, we don't like this. Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress is established September of 1774. It convenes in Philadelphia. And it brings together many of the most prominent men in 12 colonies. Only Georgia doesn't send any representation. And so here we see a direct response to the Intolerable Act, what's happening in Boston, in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. All the people you know and love. Patrick Henry's there. George Washington's there. Richard Henry Lee's there. John and Samuel Adams is there. John Dickinson's there. Benjamin Franklin shows up. Patrick Henry, who had been railing against the British as a Virginian legislature down in the colony of Virginia, immediately identifies himself as not a Virginian, but an American. And so almost immediately, you do have a small minority of these guys in Philadelphia in 1774 who are saying, we're Americans. It's us against them. And the them is the British government, and British, and we are Americans united on this side of the ocean. Even though though Patrick Henry is this kind of firebrand, the first thing the First Continental Congress does in September of 1774 is they reaffirm their allegiance to the British Crown. They reaffirm that they are good, loyal citizens of the British Empire, subjects of King George III. However, they do have some quibbles. We've got some problems we want to address. They create the Suffolk Resolve. This is a resolve that they passed which urged all members of British North America to refuse following any new laws, to start withholding your taxes, and start preparing for war. Start collecting gunpowder, start collecting guns, start collecting cannons. They adopted a call to halt all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies, and they encouraged domestic manufacturing. They then created committees of safety. So you have the committees of correspondence, which are already in place. Now you're going to have committees of safety. What are committees of safety? Committees of safety are there to organize on the local level. Let's collect the guns, let's collect the ammunition, let's collect the gunpowder. The Committee of Safety will oversee mandates and take action against the enemies of liberty. Let's talk about that right there. To take action against the enemies of liberty. You're organizing your Committee of Safety in Salisbury, Massachusetts. And there are a group of people in Salisbury, Massachusetts who are still loyal to the Crown, who do not like what you're doing, so you have to identify them, and you start creating lists. Lists of people who in the future will be less loyal, or may be potential spies who may infiltrate your business. So let's keep tabs on them. Who do we have working in their house? Well, there's a servant girl that goes there every day. She's friends with my little sister. Okay, bring her in. We want to know what that guy's doing every day. We want you to report to us once a week. We want to know where he's going, who he's talking to, whose businesses he's operating with. Because to be very crude, when shit hits the fan, we're going to need to take that guy out, or at least limit his response so that we can affect revolution and take over. Lists. We gotta have names on lists. We gotta have people watching those people on the lists. That's what the Committee of Safety does. By early 1775, nearly 9,000 men are serving on local committees throughout the colonies, circumventing the power of established governments that derive their power from Great Britain. They're made up of small farmers, artisans, and propertyless men. And these organizations have greatly increased their political discussions and organizations. By 1775, you sometimes have two different governing bodies in a colony. You'll have the legitimate colonial legislature, which is loyal to the king, and then you'll have a shadow legislature, which is comprised of these committees of safety, committees of correspondence, and they're working to circumvent everything that the colonial legislature is doing. Oh, by the time, half the time, some guys are going to be serving in the colonial legislature, and they're also secretly going to be serving on the committees of safety. Revolutions take a lot of work. They require a lot of duplicity, and a lot of lying, and a lot of sneaking around. It's always a lot of fun, too. You're going to try to be really addressing the main point of colonialism by telling yourself that we're no longer going to trade with Great Britain, that we're going to work on domestic manufacturing. That is getting at the very heart of why Britain wants colonies to begin with. If you're not going to trade with Britain anymore, that's the whole purpose of colonies being there. So that's just going to exacerbate the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, because the mother country needs that trade. They need you shipping tobacco, rice, sugar, lumber, fish, foodstuffs to the mother country. And if you start saying we're not going to do that, well, then we have a problem. Because you forgot that's your whole point of existence, is to provide the mother country with stuff. The talk of liberty pervaded the colonies. All of a sudden, non-English groups are getting involved with this. You have Germans, Irish. More and more people are adopting the language of universal rights rather than merely claiming historical rights. Thomas Jefferson writes a summary view of the rights of British America in 1774, which is a written instructions to the Virginia delegation of the Continental Congress. In that summary, he argues that colonists are free people claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Here we have the full completion of the Lockean view of universal rights. Jefferson says, I, an individual, have rights that even the king himself cannot take away. And oh, by the way, The king has those rights too, so I share the same universal rights that the king does, which means that takes him from up here and puts him all the way down here on eye level with me. Remember the idea of hierarchy? Remember God ordained king, stuff like that? This is the breakdown of this stuff. This is a product of the Enlightenment, a product of the scientific revolution of the 1700s, a product of the Great Awakening. It's all culminating right here. At the same time, they're still proclaiming their loyalty to the king. They merely would like to have equal partnership in the British Empire. But this idea of universal rights is rolling around, and a lot of people are talking about it, particularly people who, folks like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, particularly are not thinking of when they think of universal rights. People on the lower end of the economic spectrum, slaves, women, Native Americans, everybody's talking about this in the colonies. And revolutions have a tendency to jump the rails pretty quickly, especially when you start talking about big ideas. By spring of 1775, fighting breaks out in New England. So the army's in Boston. You have Lexington about 8 miles away, and then about 5 miles past Lexington is the town of Concord. The British Army now has about 6,000 men stationed in Boston to maintain the blockade, to maintain the closing of the port. The Sons of Liberty, along with the Continental Congress, have delegations all through the rest of Massachusetts. They've been collecting guns, gunpowder, cannons, and arming themselves. The British hear on April 18th that there's a stash of arms in Lexington and Concord, and that leadership of the Sons of Liberty are there. So they organize a 2,000-man expedition. They leave Boston and head towards Lexington and Concord. Sons of Liberty have operatives operating in Boston, keeping an eye on the British Army. They realize what's happening. They know exactly where they're going. They have spies in the British headquarters. They have spies. You know, come on. You're a British Army officer. Do you think you actually dump your own urine pile? Do you think you actually get your own water? Do you think you make your own food? No, you got people who do that for you, and they all live and work in Boston, and they also work in Sons of Liberty. So they're passing information along that way. When the army moves, riders are going to go out from Boston to Lexington and Concord, spreading the alarm. Other riders are going to go elsewhere into the Massachusetts area, all the way down to Connecticut, Rhode Island, all the way into New York. Who's the most famous of these riders? Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere is the most famous one. He's captured by British soldiers right here. Didn't even make it to Lexington. His compadre, a guy named Dawes, got there. There's also about 15 other people riding, but none of their names rhyme as well as Revere's does. The poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, is written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1861. He writes it because he would like to inspire patriotism amongst Americans, because they are now facing an even greater test of the American Revolution, the Civil War. And thousands upon thousands upon thousands of school children for the next 100 years get to memorize the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere in school houses and repeat it on July 4th barbecues to all their families' delight. And everybody seems to think Paul Revere does everything. You know. By the time they get to Lexington, a small group of Massachusetts militiamen, known as the Minutemen, have formed up on Lexington Green. There they fight with the British Army. The British Army pushes them all the way to Concord. When they get to Concord and Lexington, however, they discover that all the arms and munitions and the leadership of the Sons of Liberty have been squirreled away or taken out. So by the time they get to Concord, they find nothing. They then have to turn around and march all the way back to Boston. Unfortunately, by this time, hundreds of militiamen from around the colonies are now lining the roads, taking pot shots at the British Army as they retreat all the way back. All told, 49 dead Americans, 73 dead British. At the end of the day, the British are back in Boston. And fortifications have now been built on Dorchester Heights, Cambridge. The New England militia is now circling Boston, trapping the British in the town. 2 months later, on June 17, 1775, the British attempt to break out of this by attacking this peninsula right here. They land 2,000 troops and they attack colonial militia fortifications on Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill is right in front of another hill called Bunker Hill, which is where the colonial militia retreats after losing the battle. However, during the entire battle, they managed to kill about 1,000 British soldiers. In fact, the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775 is by, if you take the percentage of people involved with the numbers killed in the battle, it's the bloodiest battle in the American Revolution. Like 1/5 of all British dead in the American Revolution died in Bunker Hill. Boston will be under siege by the colonial militia and later the Continental Army until March of 1776. When George Washington is put in command of the Continental Army, he's given that command by the Continental Congress. He organizes the New England militia. They bring cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. That is 59 cannons and 14 mortars. And they start lining the hills around Boston with this. So on middle of March 1776, the British Navy wakes up one day and finds that they have guns trained on them. At which point, on March 17th, 1776, the British Army and the British Navy evacuate Boston. 10,000 British soldiers leave, along with 1,100 loyalists. March 17th is what holiday? It's Evacuation Day, you're right. No, it's St. Patrick's Day too. In Boston, it's called Evacuation Day. It's a state holiday. Everybody gets the day off for school because this is the day in which the British Army evacuated from Boston. Now, of course, St. Patrick's Day in Boston, a bunch of Irish people live in Boston. St. Patrick's Day is going to kind of really take over this holiday by the 19th century, but still today, every city school in Boston gets out on March 17th because of evacuation. War, which was unavoidable, is now being openly declared in the colonies. Britain has declared open rebellion and begins dispatching thousands of troops following March 17, 1776. So the American Revolution really starts as a colonial dispute between Massachusetts and the British Crown, and then really kind of evolves into New England. And then by 1775, 1776, we see the rest of the colonies getting in on it as well. The further you get away from New England, though, the further people are more hesitant to take on the British government. Because the British government at this time is the largest military, largest navy in the world. So we have that question of independence. We are fighting the war from April of 1775 for almost a year and a couple months before we have the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. There are stories of George Washington in command of the Continental Army, meeting with his officers and having dinner in which they would toast the health of the king while ringing the town of Boston and fighting the British Army. It's not as clear cut yet. The Second Continental Congress, which had been meeting since May of 1775, is sending petitions to the king. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. This idea that we're going a little crazy, things are getting a little bit out of hand. Let's slow things down. Let's get together and talk about it. Continental Congress is saying we have legitimate concerns. We have legitimate problems with this taxation stuff. We don't want to fight you. We want to be loyal British subjects. By all accounts, it's believed that the King of England, King George III, never even read the Olive Branch Petition. Instead, in October of 1775, he basically issued a proclamation to Parliament stating that all of his colonies should be loyal, and should follow the laws, and if they are in an open rebellion, then those leaders need to be hunted down and hanged. That comes out around November of 1775, so that's going to lead some people who've been sitting on the fence to kind of go over to independence. Then we have Thomas Paine in the winter of 1775, 1776. He writes a pamphlet known as Common Sense. Thomas Paine was a recent immigrant to British North America. He only arrived in 1773, but he was very articulate. And in his pamphlet, Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America on the following interesting subjects of the origins and designs of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution, on monarchy and hereditary succession, on thoughts on the present state of American affairs, and of the present ability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections written by an Englishman. Titles used to be really detailed, really long there. And then he includes some Latin stuff on the front page there. Man knows no master, save creating heaven, or those whom choice and common good ordain. He writes it all in English, however. This pamphlet is not in Latin or Greek. He writes it in the common tongue. He gave the colonists in the pamphlet Common Sense a ready-made argument for independence. And this easily accessible pamphlet, it could be read to you if you didn't even know how to read. It could be read to you in the tavern. It could be read to you in your home. He argued for a democratic system based on frequent elections with the rights of citizens protected by a written constitution. Independence from Britain, he argued, would provide freedom of trade, which will be a boon to the economic system of British North America. Now you can trade with Spain, now you can trade with France, you can trade with the whole world. He also said if America was free, then they would be free from the imperial wars of Europe. All these wars that Europe have all the time, he says, if you are free in the United States, if you're free in America, then you don't have to go fight Britain's wars. You don't have to pick up the sword and go off and fight every time they have a little spat with Spain, a little spat with Holland. Moving beyond practical reasons, Thomas Paine also argued this. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Paine argued, quote, that the new nation will become an asylum of freedom for all mankind. Nearly 150,000 copies were printed. They sold like gangbusters. Profits went to buy supplies for the Continental Army. This pioneers a new style of American political writing. We're not going to write in fancy Latin. We're not going to write in fancy Greek. We're going to write in the common tongue because you, as a rightful citizen of this country, deserve the right to understand political theories and ideas without having to be educated. Your rights are guaranteed no matter how smart or how stupid you are. We don't have an intelligence test for citizens in this country. We see the beginnings of this with Common Sense. It's designed to expand dramatically the public sphere where political discussion will take place. This pamphlet, along with British attacks in Virginia and South Carolina during the winter and spring of 1776, slowly pushes public opinion towards complete and utter dissolvement of the relationship between the British colonies and Great Britain. So then we get the Declaration of Independence. Argued by the Second Continental Congress from May of 1776 through July of 1776. It was quite passionately argued. A majority of the colonists were in favor of independence. However, there were three main colonies that held out: Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina. John Adams is leading the debate on the floor through most of this argument, debating that they need to, several different arguments. He says we're already in a state of war with Britain, so this is just going to be common sense. Let's get together. Common sense. Let's get it together. Because if we're apart, if we're separate, the British can defeat us one at a piece, and we're all going to die. Two, he says we can create a brand new country based on our rights. Finally, they call for a session. South Carolina requests a recess of like 3 or 4 weeks so that they can receive further instruction from their delegation in South Carolina. During that time period, John Adams argues that he would like to form a committee to write a Declaration of Independence in case independence is passed. John Hancock, who's the president of the Congress, says, sure, form the committee. So you have John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston. Okay, Robert Livingston? Forget him. No. You got 5 guys. Roger Sherman is the other guy. 5 guys on this committee. They're in charge of writing the Declaration of Independence. Now, show of hands here. Who here has ever been in a group project in school? All right. Everybody did all the work equally, right?
No.
No. Who did all the work? One person does all the work. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Because, according to John Adams, who later wrote a letter describing this, now he described this as how the meeting went. Thomas Jefferson was like, I remember it a little differently, but I like John Adams' story better. John Adams just says to Thomas Jefferson, I would like you to write the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson goes, well, I think there's other people who are better writers than me. And he goes, John Adams, no, stop. Let me give you my reasons. Here it is. Reason number 1. I read your summary of the rights of British America, which you wrote for the Virginia delegation in 1774, and you have a quality in your writing that is unsurpassed. Number 2, I'm far too busy to do any of this. I serve on like 15 other boards. I'm also leading the debate on the floor, so I can't do this. Number 3, I am New Englander, you are Virginian. Virginia is the largest colony, and if a Virginian writes it, then we can have more support from those other colonies, whereas if a New Englander writes it, it seems like it's just coming from New England. And then his 4th reason was this. He says, I am viewed by many people in Congress as stubborn, obstinate, disliked. John Adams is not a great guy to have at a party. John Adams is right. You are wrong. John Adams is smarter than everybody in the room, and he likes to show off. And that's not somebody you want to have drinks with after arguing all day at the Continental Congress. So those 4 reasons John Adams convinces, according to John Adams' story, convinces Thomas Jefferson to write. Thomas Jefferson does write the Declaration of Independence. However, when it's done with, it gets to be reviewed. So the committee is going to go through and they're going to take stuff out. Then it's going to be reviewed by everybody in the Continental Congress. It is ratified and signed on July 4th. However, actual independence of the United States passed on July 2nd. Because the vote put towards the Continental Congress was whether or not these united colonies should be independent. And when South Carolina came back from the recess, they had received instruction from their state delegation that they should support independence. New York, Pennsylvania received instruction that they should support independence. New York abstained from the vote. So when they voted on July 2nd for independence, 12 colonies, at that point they were calling them states, 12 states voted yes for independence, 0 states voted against it, and New York abstained. July 2nd is the birthday of our country. July 2nd is when the United States was formed, because that is when the Continental Congress in 1776 said, we are no longer subjects of England. Why do we celebrate July 4th? Because that's when the actual Declaration of Independence, the language of the Declaration of Independence was approved. And everybody had their hand in it, but it's still there. Thomas Jefferson's bones are still there. Now, everybody will pull out their pocket Constitution and Declaration of Independence. One of these days, I'm going to get a whole crate of these things and just pass them out, because I think everybody should. Grandfather carried one in his front pocket. Had a teacher in high school, that's where this one came from, my AP US history teacher, he carried one around. He gave one to everybody in class. So the actual Declaration of Independence is really just a list of grievances. The bulk of it, like 75% of it, it's the last 75% of it is really just like, here's the reasons why we're leaving. It's a declaration. Here's the reasons why we're leaving. It's a lot of he has. When they say he, they mean the king. The king is the representation of the government of Britain. So he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of blah, 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 all the way. The bad guy, he doesn't represent our rights, he doesn't recognize our legitimacy, and we don't like him. That's dumb. If it was that reason only, the Declaration of Independence would not be that important. What's important is what Jefferson says before he gets involved. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with the another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now that is all one sentence, first of all, which is problematic to me as a writer. So there are flaws in the Declaration of Independence. I have some grammar things I want to point out. That is one sentence. Do not write that way. However, it's a very fancy sentence, and what that fancy sentence is basically saying is that we're about to do something very important, and when you do something very important, it's probably nice that you kind of admit why you're doing it. And then he goes on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's social compact, John Locke, all right there. Consent of the governed. He does change it a little bit. Life, liberty, and property is what John Locke says. Jefferson adds pursuit of happiness, which adds a nice little difference in American identity. Jefferson's preamble, what I just read to you, is what makes this more than just a document that lists a bunch of grievances. He's not only indicting Britain, he's not only saying, Britain, you're doing this, Britain, you're doing that, he indicts all mankind. All governments, he says, rest upon the consent of the governed. He emphasizes the natural rights and universal freedoms over those of the rights of Englishmen. This is not the right of Englishmen to declare their independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Like, once again, the stupidest person in the room, it is self-evident that you have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Jefferson's prose breaks free from the constraints of ethnicity, class, gender, and sex. At no point does he say all. All Englishmen, or all white men. He does use the word man, but he's using the word man as they say when we say mankind, that kind of gender, he does use this idea. This is one of the most idealistic written works ever produced in the history of humanity. And it's going to have a long reach. Replacing Locke's property with pursuit of happiness signals another departure. Pursuit of happiness argues for an open-ended, democratic process whereby individuals develop their own potential and seek to realize their own life goals. Individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by government, would become a central element of American freedom. Tradition would no longer rule the present, and Americans could shape their society as they see fit. Pursuit of happiness is one of our guaranteed, treasured ideals in America. I'm doing mine right now. This is it. 37 years old, I'm pursuing my happiness. I wanted to get a historical degree, I wanted to get a PhD, I wanted to teach it. This is it. Seem kind of silly? Shut up. It's my pursuit of happiness. I don't laugh at your pursuit of happiness, whatever you want to do. It's an open-ended process. If you want to go out and make a bunch of money and get a bunch of cars, get a bunch of houses, that's great, pursuit of happiness. If your pursuit of happiness is the mind, pursuing an education, growing as an individual self-fulfillment is becoming more than you are, Jefferson says, yes, you have a right to do that. You have a right to be a better person tomorrow than you are today. And God forbid anybody take that right away from you. No other nation has that set in their founding document. This idea of self-fulfillment. He also describes a distinctive definition of nationality resting on American freedom that was born in the American Revolution. American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States has a special mission to serve as a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world. It has occupied that place ever since in American nationalism, unburdened by institutions, monarchy, aristocracy, heredity, privilege. America and America alone is the place where the principle of universal freedom could take root. In the words of Lincoln, we are the last best hope for mankind. In the words of Thomas Paine, we are an asylum of freedom. Now, the Declaration has been emulated around the world. When China first declared its nations as a republic, when they overthrew the emperor in 1911, they quoted the American Declaration of Independence. When Ho Chi Minh finally managed to kick the Japanese out in 1945, he addressed the people of Vietnam through the radio provided by American OSS. When he addressed them in Vietnam, he spoke in Vietnamese. What was the first thing he said? He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. The will of the people is present in nearly all countries around the world. The idea that the people possess rights was quickly internationalized. Slaves in the Caribbean, colonial subjects in England, India, indigenous inhabitants of Latin America can all speak this language, much to the dismay of those who exercise power over it." Now here are the flaws of the Declaration of Independence. One, nothing is self-evident. Nothing is self-evident. It cannot be self-evident. We prove things or things by arguing, by having evidence. This is a podium, not a table. This is not a podium, it's a table. I have to have evidence, argumentative evidence to prove this. Your right to life, you have no right to life in this universe. Your life is a speck of dust to the cosmic universe. What goes on in this little orb, this little marble, the universe does no care for your rights. Liberty, pursuit of happiness, none of that. Crush every atom, every molecule in the known universe, crush it down into a fine powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and show me one molecule of justice. Show me one atom of mercy. Show me one element of love. It does not exist in the natural world. But it could. Because we have the ability to conceive of things that are not solid, that are abstract ideas. And that's what he's talking about here, this abstract notion that we can build a better world, a better society. Now, when Jefferson is writing this, he owns 100 people. He owns 100 human beings who are his property. He works on his land in Monticello to make the fortune he has in order to live the life he wants to live, in order to have the freedom to write this. When he says all men are created equal, he has a perfect idea in his head of what he means. White men who own property. That's not what he wrote. He didn't write all white men who own property are created equal. He wrote all men are created equal. And that's basic fact, that he wrote it down, that I can carry it in my pocket, that I can pull it out and read it anytime I want to. It means that I'm not the only person who can do that, anybody can do it. And God forbid that someone, at some point, since 1776, has had the audacity to read his words and have the audacity to think, maybe this applies to me. Landless farmer in Kentucky, black slave in Florida, woman living in Tennessee in the 1920s, 18-year-olds in the 1960s. People all over the world read this and go, some of them have the audacity to go, maybe this applies to me, maybe I can have. This is how revolutions quickly go out of control. When you write something like this, that is the most idealistic and optimistic thing that we've ever produced as a society, that's where revolutions go off the rails. Because someone somewhere who you didn't intend to is reading this, and they have the audacity to go, me too. Finally, the last thing about the Declaration of Independence that I need you to understand is that this guarantees no laws or rights that you have by law. That's the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, your rights of life, liberty, and my rights as guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence do not exist in the entire basis of American law. All legal basis in this country rests upon the Constitution, not the Declaration of Independence. That is not to say that the Declaration of Independence is not important. The Declaration of Independence does loom large in the American imagination. If you go visit the National Archives, you have to go into the hall where our documents sit. To your left will be the Bill of Rights, to your right will be the Constitution, but in the middle, in the place of honor, is the Declaration of Independence. Because it is the ideals of who we want to be. This is who we want to be. This is us on January 1st every year. This is our resolution. This is the person we want to be. This is the republic we want to be. A republic in which everyone is created equal, in which everyone has the rights to live their life to the full extent that they wish to live. The Constitution is who you are on February 17th. The Constitution is who you are after you've abandoned your New Year's resolutions of January 1st. The Declaration is who we want to be. The Constitution is who we are. And there's some conflict there. Just like there's conflict on the personal level of who you want to be and who you are. Once we declare independence, the game's on. Fighting the revolution. Declaring independence is a big deal. Here's the problem with it. You have to actually achieve independence. You know, I can't just declare something and then it happens. I think you have to fight for it. Roughly 40% of the people living in the colonies are patriots. 20 to 25% of the people living in the colonies are loyalists, loyal to the crown. 35% of the colonists, including many of my own ancestors, could care less. King in England, president or king in Philadelphia, we still haven't figured out what kind of government we're going to have. If you're on the frontier or you're in a place that's rural and out of the way, who cares who's in charge? Kings in England, presidents in Philadelphia, none of that gets the corn in. None of that protects me in the winter. None of that keeps me safe and grows my crops. I could care less. 20,000 loyalists are going to join the British Army. The British immediately offer freedom to any slave that runs away from their southern masters if they are patriots. And the British Army will actually set up organizations and regiments, they call them Ethiopian regiments, are black slaves fighting for the British government against the patriots. Because the British Army is now accepting slaves as soldiers, George Washington, against his better judgment, he didn't want to do this, but he had to kind of do it. He does offer freedom to any black slave who fights for 1 year for the Continental Army. 5,000 former slaves will fight for the Continental Army. Yeah, 50,000 colonial slaves flee during the war. That's 10% of the slave population in the colonies. Washington himself is going to lose 17 slaves during the war. They flee to the British lines, where they are discovered to be very valuable to the British because they have information about George Washington's personal life, where he's at, where his wife's at, stuff like that. The Continental Army is the backbone of the Patriot forces. At most, it's only about 4,000 to 5,000 men strong. You would serve in units based upon your state, so you would have the North Carolina line, you'd have the Maryland line, the Pennsylvania line. You're supported by a Continental Congress who's supposed to pay you monthly. They never do. They're supposed to provide you with fresh food, clothing, and weapons. They never do. Everything has to start from scratch. We have to create a whole economy, a whole base of it, and start printing money. And how valuable our paper money is depending on how well the war's going all the time. If the war's not going very well, guess how much that paper money's worth? Not very much. These 4,000 to 5,000 men at most throughout the war are going to be augmented by local militias, which are just temporary soldiers. Militias are not trained very well, and they don't like going very far away from home. So the North Carolina militia is not going to be found in New York. The Massachusetts militia is not going to be found in New York. They don't like being very far away from home. They're supposed to be only temporary because they have families and farms they have to get back to. Likewise, we also have some Indian allies. For the most part, however, most Native American tribes do join the British side because the British are the ones protecting their land rights west of the Appalachian Mountains. Our Continental Army will be trained by many European officers Baron von Steuben is a Prussian military officer who comes in 77. He doesn't speak a lick of English, so he has a translator that he translates through. He's going to train to drill them, how to march in formation, like I talked about yesterday. You have the Marquis de Lafayette, who comes from France, who's going to help train as well. All told, though, George Washington has a bit of a problem. His army is always going to be less numbered than the British Army. His army is going to be less trained than the British Army. So he becomes very adept at avoiding fighting. He just has to maintain the army. All he needs to do is make sure that this is going to be a long and drawn-out war, and eventually the British will get tired of fighting and go away. So when he does fight, he's not very successful. He is 6-8. That's his win-loss record. So he can't even qualify for a bowl. You know, so he's like, that's how many wins he's got, that's how many losses he has. He does really good at it too. It helps that his army's never more than like 5,000 men, 6,000 men. The first phase of the war happens in New England and the Middle Colonies. Boston is evacuated in 1776. The British head to Halifax. There they gain 20,000 men in reinforcements, 500 ships, and they come back and they take over New York. Like they just steam into New York, take it over. Washington tries to stop them on Manhattan Island. Pretty much though, after the Battle of Long Island, he's retreating through New Jersey. You do have a few wins in New Jersey, most notably the Battle of Trenton. But for the most part, all these squiggly lines is him running around trying to avoid getting caught in a battle. In 1777, however, the British try to invade from Quebec, coming down Canada towards present-day Albany. They are stopped at the Battle of Saratoga. There, the British Army surrenders to the Americans. This battle in 1777 is the turning point of the Revolution because this is the battle that convinced the French government that we were serious and that our nation would succeed. So the French formally recognized the United States of America and then allied with us. They're going to provide us with guns, gunpowder, and 1.3 billion levers, $13 billion in 2014. How valuable was French assistance? 90% of all the guns we used in the American Revolution were made in France. We cannot survive the revolution without France. France is headed by King Louis XVI. He's ready to revenge himself from the battles that they lost 10 years before the French and Indian War. And because France recognizes us, we also get recognized by the nations of Spain and Holland. That means we can all get money. Now, this money isn't freely given to us, it's loans. But when you're fighting a revolution and you're throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, in the battle, who cares what the interest rate is? After 1779, the war shifts south. The British change their strategies. They believe the South is lukewarm at best towards independence, so they immediately capture Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, and they begin working their ways up through the Carolinas to fight. They ultimately end at Yorktown, Virginia, which is very much near Jamestown's colony. They're blocked in by land by American and French forces. They're blocked by sea by the French Navy. On October 19th, Cornwallis and his British Army surrender. When they turned over all their guns and their cannons to the American Army, the surrender ceremony, the band played a very popular tune at the time called The World Turned Upside Down. Real quick, before we leave, I'll talk about one more thing. When they fought in the South, the turning point of the Southern campaign is the Battle of Cowpens, which occurs on January 17th, 1781. This will give you an idea of how the colonists and the Americans and the British are fighting in the Revolution. It's a small battle. All battles in the American Revolution are very small by modern standards. Very rarely are you going to have more than 10,000 soldiers combined fighting each other. The Battle of Cowpens is roughly 1,800 Continental soldiers and 1,150 British. The Continental Army is down there. They have about 900 men in the Continental Army. The other 900 men are militia. They're local Carolina militia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee militias called the Over the Mountain Boys. They're commanded by a Virginian by the name of Dan Morgan. Dan Morgan's a rough-spoken frontier soldier. He's a veteran of the Battle of Saratoga. The British are commanded by Lord Bannister Tarleton, a flamboyant cavalry officer who works in Cornwallis's army. Here's how Morgan sets up the battle. One, half his army is militia, and he knows they are unreliable. So, he finds a cow pen. Cow pens are these meadow places with no trees that folks would bring their cattle to before cattle drives. You bring your cattle out there for about a month and a half, you let them graze and fatten up, because when you drive them to market, you're going to drive them for 200 miles. When cattle are having to move 200 miles, they're working their muscles, they're going to get thinner. So you're going to fatten them up in the cow pen before you send them off to market. He knows that the British are going to attack. There's a road that leads right this through the cow pen, and there's a hill kind of right here. So he puts skirmishers out front. These are guys who are going to be about 50 to 100 yards in front of the main line. They're the ones who'll see the enemy coming first. They'll fire a couple shots, and then they'll retreat back to the main line. He puts his untrained militia in the next line. He tells his militia that he would like them to fire 2 shots. Load their weapons, fire 1 shot, then load their weapons again, fire 2 shots, and once they're done with their 2 shots, retreat. All through the war, the militia had been used by George Washington in battles, and they proved to be very unreliable. When the militia is pressured by trained British soldiers, they retreat, because guess what? Militia are just farmers who happen to be in the army for a couple of weeks. And don't nobody come here to get killed by the British army, so we're going to get out of here. They retreat all the time. Morgan is hoping this is what's expected by the British. Behind his militia, right behind a small hill so they can't be seen from the British, is the Continental Line. These are the battle-hardened veterans of Washington's campaigns up north. So, Tarleton lines his forces up, they attack, the skirmishers retreat, the militia fires 2 shots, they retreat all the way back here, at which point the British believe they've won the battle, they start charging. They charge up the hill. Right when they get over the crest of the hill, they run into the line of the Continental Army that is battle hardened. They wait until those guys are how close? Like 50 yards. Once you see the whites in their eyes, and they unleash a devastating volley into the now disorganized British army. Because once the British thought they won, you start losing that cohesion. You start having holes in the line. Part of the other plan was that he had cavalry right back here, commanded by a distant cousin of George Washington, a guy named William Washington. This cavalry is going to come around like this and hit the British in the right flank. The militia, which has retreated, is going to reform, and they're going to come around and hit the British in the left flank. This is known in military parlance as a double envelopment. Right now at West Point are a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who are training to be officers in our United States Army. And when they lay their heads down every night in their barracks, and they dream their sweet dreams, the dream that they're dreaming of is a double envelopment. Because even in 21st century battle tactics, if you attack your opponent from the front and from both sides, can someone fire at 3 different angles? Nope. This is going to create an utter victory, an utter devastation to the enemy. A double envelopment is the wet dream of every military commander ever. The most successful double envelopment was the Battle of Cannae, where Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal and won the last Punic War for the Roman Republic. Here at Cowpens, we have a double envelopment. This completely destroys Bannister Tarleton's British army. He manages to escape. However, 86% of the British side suffered casualties. Now, casualties are killed, wounded, and captured. The majority of the British soldiers are captured. This spirits up the people, according to Dan Morgan, and it shifted the momentum toward the Patriot forces in the South. I grew up 10 miles from Cowpens, spent many of my youth traveling over that battlefield. One day I got very lucky. I found a woman who actually loved me, and she could put up with going to the Battle of Cowpens and listening to me ramble about it. So here's a good visual description of what happens. The British are coming, but the Continental Army stands in their way, and there's a victory for all. That's all I got for you today. We'll talk about the consequences of the American Revolution tomorrow. I will grade your math